Okay, time is coming. Hi everyone. I hope you are all here again. I'd like to open this keynote session. I'm pleased to introduce Miss Jane Davidson. Let me introduce her shortly. She's the author of Future Gen, which is on the slide. Lesson from a Small Country in 2020. The story of why Wales was the first country in the world to introduce legislation to protect future generations. Future Gen is published by, currently translated in Japanese, and she will be introduced at the end of her presentation. Now we can buy on either even in Amazon. From 2000 to 2011, Jane was the Minister of Education, the Minister of Environment, Sustainability, and Health in the Welsh government, where she proposed a law to make protecting future generations the central organizing principle of government. The Well-being of Future Generations Act came into the law in 2015. Maybe we can learn today from her how it went. I like to give the floor to Jen. So now you have a floor. Please start.
Thank you, arigato. Arigato, Masako. I'm so delighted to join this conference today. I was very interested to catch Michael's contribution. And I think that all my work, in a way, has been now for 30 years trying to find a way to make law and policy serve the interests of future generations. So what I'm going to talk about in my session today is the story about why Wales has a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And I think what's important to say at the outset is that these ideas don't come from nowhere. The work that the future design movement is doing in Japan and more widely, and I know I've benefited from it myself, is actually work that is always building a movement of more people who will believe that a good future is possible. So I hope that our small contribution as the country of Wales will be helpful in looking at how we reached a point where we decided that we had to make a law, because without a law, we would not be able to deliver on our ambitions. And my presentation today, Act Today for the Future, the Pathway to the Enactment of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Wales Act, is the title of the book as translated into Japanese. I want to start with my first tribute to Donella Meadows. Donella Meadows was a systems thinker whose life was cut too short. I first came across her in 1992 at the first Earth Summit, but it was her book from 1973 called Limits to Growth, which has had such a profound effect on my life. And the reason it had such a profound effect is that when she wrote Limits to Growth, she looked as a systems thinker at the ecological footprint across the world and let governments across the world know that they were overusing the Earth's resources. At the time, she thought that letting them know that would mean that they would then take action. She'd given them the evidence, they would then take the action. But sadly, it was not to be. And it was not until actually after her death in 2003, Limits to Growth, the 30-year update was published, when she had reviewed what governments need, or what politicians need, what lawmakers need, what policymakers need, in terms of encouraging them to make decisions that will benefit future generations. And you will see during my presentation, there are 5 key elements to this, and these are the 5 chapters in terms of how my book is structured. So visioning, taking off the constraints of feasibility, of disbelief and past disappointments, and letting your mind dwell upon its most noble, uplifting and treasured dreams. And this is critically important. People have to believe in visions. For too long, those of us who've been passionate about climate and nature, we've often tried to use fear as a way of bringing people to a greater understanding, talking about the threats of climate, the threats to nature. But actually, we also know that fear can turn people off, turn people away from taking any action themselves. So visioning has to be saying, what if we could create a better future, which of course is right at the heart of the future design movement. The story for us, in many ways, started back in 1999, when we had a new National Assembly for Wales. Now, in the UK, and I'm sure many people on the call are aware that the UK is made up of 4 different nations: Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, and England. And of course, most people think of the UK as England because it is 90% of the United Kingdom is England, which is why back in 1999, the then Prime Minister, Tony Blair from the Labour Party, decided that there needed to be some additional governance arrangements that reflected the characteristics of different countries in the UK. And the year before, we'd had the Government of Wales Act. And in Wales, we were given a unique duty to promote sustainable development in the exercise of all our functions. And I was one of the new members of the National Assembly for Wales, democratically elected, terribly excited about becoming part of the new democracy and knowing nothing about this new duty. But this was a very important new duty because actually it was included in the Government of Wales Act by UK Welsh politicians who had proposed that this was in the characteristics of Wales. Wales has always been a very green country, a very rural country, a very community-based country, and wanted to see the idea of sustainable development using the Brundtland definition of sustainable development, the one used by the UN, development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So we were the only part of the United Kingdom to actually have a duty in our founding law, so a constitutional law, to promote sustainable development in everything that we did. And as you'll see below, it's not just a phrase. It actually includes the concepts of needs, the essential needs of the world's poor, to which overriding priority should be given. And that's really important in Wales because we are now still the poorest part of the United Kingdom. And the idea that a law should put limitations in place to make sure that the technology and social organization does not compromise on the environment's ability to meet present and future needs. So we have this set up in Wales that is nowhere else in the United Kingdom. The second key principle that Donella introduced was that you didn't just have to have the vision, you had to be prepared to create a movement, which is why you'll probably hear me say more than a couple of times, but it is all for me about how we turn a moment into a movement, how we can build that movement across the world, because a network is non-hierarchical. It's a web of connections amongst equals. It's held together not by force or obligation or material incentive or social contract, but by shared values and understanding that some tasks can be accomplished together that could never be accomplished separately. And this is critical because often in hierarchies, the decisions are taken at the top, and we talk a lot about how we get more bottom-up decision-making and thinking about future generations. But if we can create a network across all stratas of society, then we can influence politics, law, and policy in many, many different countries across the world, because it will be a people's charter for how we can live a better way. And in our case, we were very lucky to be able to rely on a superb group of advisors when we first started, advisors who were called the Sustainable Development Commission. They were set up under that same Labour government, under Tony Blair, as in the millennium, and they were advising governments of all political colours. And because Northern Ireland has always been very different in its politics, it's had some very right-wing governments. We've had some independent governments, nationalist governments, socialist governments. In fact, all variations of government across the UK. So the Sustainable Development Commission gave non-political party advice to achieving a sustainable economy, to how you promote good governance. Because for me, good governance is all about keeping populations safe and making sure that decisions benefit current and future generations. Using sound science, living within environmental limits, ensuring a strong, healthy and just society. So we were really lucky in the sense that all parts of the UK had access to the superb work of the Sustainable Development Commission. And it was as part of that work that when I was leading this agenda in Wales, we used a similar way of expressing what a Wales that actually was conscious of wanting to live a one planet life would look like. So when I published One Wales, One Planet in 2009, we talked about living within our environmental limits, having healthy, biologically diverse and productive ecosystems, a resilient and sustainable economy with safe and sustainable and attractive communities, and is fair and just and bilingual. And for those of you who may not realize that, Welsh is a living language. It's one of the oldest languages in the world, as old as Icelandic. Many parts of the British Isles spoke Welsh in the Middle Ages, for example. But now Welsh is a safe minority language, which is used throughout our schools, used in the workplace, used in health services, used in our economy, and doing gallu siarad Cymraeg dim bach, I can speak some Welsh and I communicate daily. Very, very different language to English. So this sustainable development scheme that we called One Wales, One Planet outlined how we would reduce our ecological footprint in Wales with our own policies. At the time, we had no capacity to make law, but we had capacity to make policy. And then suddenly, in 2010, there was a change of government. And as a result of the change of government, in came a Conservative and Liberal Democrat partnership government. And one of the things that they'd said to the people of the UK when they put themselves forward for election was that they were going to remove as many as possible of what we call in the UK non-departmental public bodies which have served all four nations, but which are not directly controlled by government. And overnight, the Sustainable Development Commission, which I've just been so complimentary about, disappeared, literally overnight. I went to speak at their 10th anniversary conference, and a man from the UK government came and said there would be no minister there because the funding was being removed. And so it was closed overnight. And the important thing about this is you never know what are going to be the catalysts that help you make decisions. And if I was talking in modern young people's language in the UK now, I'd say this is the spoiler alert, because I had no idea that the Sustainable Development Commission was not protected in law. I assumed that it had been set up in law 10 years earlier, but it had no protection in law. It was just a policy body. And literally, while I was at that conference, I realized that we, who had the duty to promote sustainable development in everything we did, were really struggling to get people to understand what we meant by sustainable development. And I realized in one of those flashes of insight that if we were going to do this seriously, we had to change a duty to promote to a duty to deliver. So in our manifesto for the next election, and I was already saying I was standing down, I went to go and work in a university for 10 years, leading on sustainability. And in our manifesto, we outlined the vision that you see on this slide below. And when I look at it now, it's such political language. It's hard for people to understand what I was proposing, but I wanted a sustainable Wales to become a one planet nation, i.e. only to use our fair share of the world's resources, by putting the Brundtland definition of sustainable development at the heart of government, by creating a resilient and sustainable economy that lives within environmental limits and only using our fair share of the Earth's resources. I.e. all the things that I proposed in One Wales, One Planet, I now wanted to turn into law. And I don't know what the system is in Japan or in other people's countries in terms of elections, but in our system, once the political party agrees the commitment should go into the manifesto, then it does. And I found myself in the strange position of at the final conference of the Labour Party in Wales before the election, I had to use an emergency resolution to propose long-term thinking. But here we are, it did go in to the manifesto. And the other thing I did at the time was, because the Sustainable Development Commission had been removed overnight, one of the members of it was the absolutely amazing person called Peter Davis, who was a commissioner and came from Wales. And so I immediately asked him to come and work with me in my office for the few months that I had left as minister. And that's very important in the Welsh story, because the reason that we have a commissioner rather than a commission or other mechanisms of accountability in Wales is because of the work that Peter Davis did, because he came and worked for me as a commissioner for sustainable futures, but with no powers at the time, because we didn't get statutory lawmaking powers in Wales until 2011, at the point that I left government. And then that legislative commitment to move forward and create a full piece of legislation, one of the first pieces of legislation made in Wales by a parliament that now had lawmaking powers, was proposed by the new First Minister in June 2011. And you see now that the framing then was to legislate to embed sustainable development, that Brundtland definition, as the central organizing principle in all the actions across government and public bodies, and externally to have a new independent sustainable development body for Wales, which is what became the Commissioner for Future Generations and the office that serves that post. Now, I hoped that that was going to be the first piece of legislation in the new administration, because for me, this is a constitutional duty. You know, just as we were the only part of the UK to have the duty to promote sustainable development, I wanted us to be the only part of the UK that made this our constitutional commitment. And therefore, when we had full lawmaking powers, it would guide everything we do from the beginning. But it was really hard for people. There were other laws that needed to be made, more normal laws. And people were struggling still to get their kind of heads behind, well, what would this mean? What would this mean for the government? What would it mean for the people of Wales? And I think this takes us to Donnella's third point, which is about truth-telling, because a system cannot function well if its information streams are corrupted by lies, not unrelieved pessimism nor sappy optimism, but the resolve to tell the truth about both the successes and the failures of the present and the potentials and obstacles of the future. And above all, the courage to admit and bear the pain of the present while keeping a steady eye on a vision of a better future. Now, we couldn't be in a present that has more pain, I think, than we are at the moment, so certainly in my adult life. And we have even harder now to keep a steady eye on a vision for a better future. But it does mean that you have to keep looking back and keep looking at the present and seeing whether the actions that you take or have been taken are delivering towards a better outcome. And for us, and although that I'd now left government, I was regularly brought in to talk to civil servants, to talk to politicians about why we wanted this specific commitment we didn't call it Future Generations then, we called it to sustainable development that meets the needs of the present without compromising on the ability of future generations to meet their needs. But we really had to interrogate why what we've been trying to do over the first decade of Wales having its own parliament didn't work. And firstly, it was because our scheme required us to promote and not deliver. And it turns out that, you know, I promote every moment of my life. It doesn't mean that anything ever changes. So promoting is simply not enough. Secondly, there was no legal definition of sustainable development. And for people who don't get the importance of this, who have been brought up to think short term, who have to write policy papers about decisions for next week, not 2050, it means how do you understand what you're going to do? What if you don't have a legal definition? And of course, what the Act has done is now enshrined that Brundtland definition of sustainable development into law in Wales. And that means that it's available in terms of a proposed law for any country, because this is the UN commitment in terms of sustainable development. We also found that in the very year the Sustainable Development Commission was removed, that the Wales Audit Office found that government was not embedding it in all its practice. It was telling us as the politicians that everybody was talking about sustainable development all the time, but it was only at the top of the organization. It was not being threaded through. There were no training mechanisms, upskilling mechanisms, institutional mechanisms to guide the adoption of such a radical idea. And in 2011, just before that critical election, the World Wildlife Fund, which, as everybody and on the call I'm sure know, is the one who publishes the State of Nature report globally. The policy report found it was not embedded across ministerial portfolios. There were 2 or 3 of us where we could be seen to be demonstrating how we wanted to apply it, but there were many other portfolios which were not. So we were not institutionally embedding, we had no legal definition, we didn't have a duty to deliver, and all these things are what contributed to what became the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. But I think the most important contribution for me was when in 2014, the UN conducted a national conversation across the world on the world we want before the creation of the Sustainable Development Goals. And we had the conversation, the Wales we want. And that was fronted not by government. And that was really clever to take it away from government, but it was fronted by a man who some of you may recognize, one of the most well-recognized actors, both in the United States and the UK, a man called Michael Sheen, who is a really strong supporter of the Act and appears in my book. And he strongly supported, along with Peter Davis, I mentioned previously, the previous commissioner, who was now chairing the big organization of all the small voluntary organizations in Wales. They led a national conversation with thousands and thousands of people across Wales, in towns, in villages, in village halls, in schools, in communities, to talk about what kind of Wales that the people of Wales wanted. And it's their words that have gone into the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So Donnella's 4th element is about learning. Learning means exploring a new path with vigor and courage, being open to other people's exploration of other paths, being willing to switch paths as one is found that leads more directly to the goal. So the learning that we did linked that truth-telling, finding what wasn't working, working with the people of Wales to create something that was distinctly and culturally Welsh, and then taking that path with vigor and courage. And I have to say, there was a lot of support then, particularly through the environmental movements, the social movements in Wales, in terms of actually taking forward this agenda about having an act that would influence all aspects of people's lives. So what you see in the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act itself is, firstly, it is a duty to deliver. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, you will see that the normal way we think about sustainable development as a 3-legged stool of society, environment, and economy, in Wales, it's become a very sturdy chair. Culture, because culture is at the heart of what we do in all our countries, and it's a celebration of different cultures. So culture, heritage, identity, that is an equally important pillar to society, environment, and economy. And the Act itself is there. That's a picture of Wales, by the way. It's not on its own. It's attached to England on the eastern side, but the 7 goals on the outside are linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, which means that they are universal goals, that actually Wales can talk in the same language of other countries because it has nuanced the 17 Sustainable Development Goals into these 7. And on the left-hand side of the screen, you see what we describe as the 5 ways of working. You have to think long-term. You have to think preventatively. You have to collaborate. You have to integrate your outcomes. And for me, most importantly, you have to involve people about whom decisions are being made. So all the public bodies in Wales, including the Welsh Government, have to deliver on those 5 ways of working. They have to deliver on the 7 goals, and they have to put at the base of what they do those 4 pillars. And the 7 goals, the language of the 7 goals is actually based upon the language in many ways, many cases here, that came back from the people of Wales in the Wales we want. And so on this slide, I'm not going to read them all out for you. These slides will be made available to you in due course, the people on this call. But a prosperous Wales is innovative, productive, and low carbon, recognizing the limits of the global environment. So you start to see the language that we started developing back in the early 2000s is language that is now enshrined into law, providing employment opportunities, allowing people to take advantage of wealth generated through securing fair work. So this idea that we will deliver on fair work, it will be low carbon, it will be innovative, it will be productive, but it will also be a society that helps people maximize their physical and mental well-being, a society that contributes more in improving biodiversity than it is taken away, a society that enables people to fulfill their potential no matter what their background on circumstances, including the socioeconomic background, but also including issues, for example, around gender and race. A Wales of cohesive communities. You know, who wouldn't want to live in an attractive, viable, safe, and well-connected community? And many of our communities are there. Many of them are very attractive, and many of them are very safe. Wales is a very safe country, but they're not viable in the sense of actually having enough local and foundational economy, and they're certainly not well connected. As somebody who lives 30 miles from a railway station, where buses can't take me anywhere on a regular basis, for example. But a Wales of vibrant culture and thriving Welsh language. And then, very importantly, globally responsible. So anything that we do in Wales is the way we must behave globally. So we cannot, for example, offshore our carbon emissions, because that would be against the spirit of the Act. So I think these 7 goals and 5 ways of working, the 4 pillars, none of which I was involved in actually creating, but all of which I strongly support, were a really fantastic way of meaning that this is a global agenda through the UN, through the Sustainable Development Goals, but it has to be created in a way that works differently in every country while still speaking a common language. So using the Brundtland definition linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, we have a common language. Where I come in is the accountability mechanisms, and this is all about that truth-telling and learning. We have, for the public services responsible to the Welsh Government can hold them to account, but the Welsh Government is also held to account by these 3 routes. The Future Generations Commissioner is a critical friend primarily, although with some powers to name and shame, we call it, to do reviews, and so that people can learn from what happens. The Auditor General for Wales, for me, is absolutely critical, because the Auditor General for Wales rules on whether money is spent well, whether the way the systems in organisations are delivering well. And at the beginning, the government wanted this to be audited separately, which would have meant it would never have been at the core of the heart of government or organisations. But now it is at the heart as a constitutional framework. And because it's a piece of legislation, it's also accountable to the courts. And the year before a Welsh election, and we have our elections, well, we have been having them every 5 years, and now they're going down to every 4 years. A year before an election, and ours is next year in May 2026, and we are being elected for the first time through proportional representation completely. We have reports, big reports, from both the Auditor General and from the Future Generations Commissioner, and they're detailed reviews so that any incoming government can learn from those reviews about what best practice looks like and what actions they might need to take as a government in terms of taking this forward. And both key regulators are saying that the Act, which is 10 years old this year, it is now well recognized in the public services, but we're still a long way from really institutional delivery. The Auditor General is looking at this in terms of the lessons from their work and how they can be adopted by public bodies, and they have some mechanisms to make that quite a hard approach. The Future Generations Commissioner is looking at, through his own strategy, which has been contributed to by the people of Wales and many young people in Wales, in looking particularly about implementation and impact, about climate and nature, about health and well-being, and culture and language, 4 pillars of his work in terms of taking this forward. In Wales, young people are quite involved in this process. We have a youth parliament that I think needs to be given much more opportunity to work with the elected parliament. They're elected themselves on a similar constituency basis. And also young people in Wales can vote at the age of 16. So there's a huge opportunity in our new national curriculum, which reflects sustainable development at the heart, for young people to have in their schools an opportunity to understand both the political, the climate, the nature, and the systems thinking involved in delivering this agenda. And finally, for Donella, and it was such an important point. So we're talking about, you've had visioning, you've had networking, you have had truth-telling, you've had learning, and her final fundamental principle is loving. She talks about the fact that, you know, if we extract everything we can from the world, the result is collapse. The take, make, waste economy that we live in at the moment, the result is collapse. If we put a time scale on that extraction, then people are encouraged to extract as much as possible, even more quickly, the result is collapse. So the sustainability revolution has to be, above all, a collective transformation that permits the best of human nature rather than the worst to be expressed and nurtured. And I think it's in that spirit that the work that I was asked to do 2 years ago was through 2 political parties coming together, 2/3 of the members of the Senedd, which is the word in Welsh we use to describe our Welsh Parliament, asking me to lead a group, an international group that I selected, in terms of looking at how we could meet our carbon emission reductions by 2035. And the reason I was asked to do that is, on the current trajectory, Wales would not meet its emissions by 2050. And therefore, the government is urgently looking at how that could be done in a fair, just, and nature positive way. And I was happy to take that on if we delivered according to the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. Everything I do still has that academic underpinning. There must be an evidence base. It may not be enough on its own, as Donella realized when she published Limits to Growth, but it has to be an underpinning base to proper and effective and good governance decision making. We launched our reports in September. It will be the anniversary of our launch this coming week. And the Commissioner and I, the Future Generations Commissioner and I, are presenting a letter, well, virtually from me because I will be in Japan. We're presenting a letter to the Deputy First Minister, who's the person you see in that picture, to ask what the government has decided to do on the outcome of our work. We were able to show that you could have 10-year delivery pathways to 2035 that would deliver the majority of outcomes, that Wales could accelerate and could definitely deliver well before 2050 if it chose to be radical enough, and if it chose to really focus on the co-benefits, the benefits for people in how it took this work forward. And so we focused not on recommendations to ministers. Having been a minister, I remember in my last week in the cabinet, I asked colleagues, and I think we had about 3,000 recommendations between us all that week from people. So recommendations to ministers often don't work. But if you lay out what the pathway can be, why the pathway has been proposed, what the pathway advice is, with references and case studies, then actually you give government a manual on how they could achieve these outcomes. And the Welsh government has to report back to the UK statutory body, the Climate Change Commission, before the end of this year. And we're confident that since the Climate Change Commission has explicitly endorsed our work, that a lot of our work will be contained in that report. And I just want to finish with a series of quotes, because I'm somebody who is always, I read a lot all the time. And I think that sometimes you read things and they just capture your imagination. And this one is one of those. Do unto future generations as you would have had past generations do unto you. And I just think that that really sums it up. My generation benefited massively from the kind of rethinking and revisualizing in the UK that happened after the Second World War. The introduction of free health services, free education services, clean water, better sewage systems, council housing. All those things were about a vision of a new kind of world. And we need to have those big visions again. I met Wangari Maathai in the COP in Copenhagen back in 2009. And as I was brought up in Africa, she has been a profound influence in my life. And she actually said this particular quote in the early 2000s, but in the course of history, there comes a time when humanity is called to shift to a new level of consciousness, to reach a higher moral ground, a time when we have to shed our fear and give hope to each other. That time is now. And what a prescient quote, because it can be used at any time that we feel that humanity has to make that shift. And I think that time is now more than it has ever been. And I just want to call out a giant among you as well in this. I just loved this way. So Yoshi, thank you so much, arigato. But he describes the Welsh Wellbeing Act as like a compass that serves as a voice representing future children, constantly asking us to prioritize their happiness and guiding us towards better choices. And I did love the fact that when my book is published in Japan, that it includes the idea of building on happiness and also supporting the work of future generations until it is done. I think you have a better title for my book than our original. And many of you will know that at the Summit of the Future in New York last year, the United Nations proposed a special envoy for future generations based on the Welsh model, and work on this was agreed by the UN General Assembly, and that's being undertaken at the moment. And we'll hear a bit more about that when the UN meets again later this month. But I'll just finish with a Welsh quote, and this is a 13th century Welsh quote, so it's been around some time, and I think that it just sums up the kind of policy approach from Wales. In Welsh, it says abo ben, byd bont, and what it means is if you want to be a leader, be a bridge. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much.